Captain Jake Morrison stood in the great hall of the Galactic Council. The room was huge and made of crystal that glowed with soft blue light. Around him sat hundreds of alien beings from dozens of different worlds. Some looked like giant insects, with many arms. Others were tall and thin like walking trees. Some had feathers and beaks like birds, but stood on two legs like humans. A few looked like living rocks that pulsed with different colors. Jake wore his best uniform, but he felt small in this place. Next to him stood Ambassador Lisa Carter. She was Earth's top diplomat and had been trying to keep humanity in the council for months. Her face was calm, but Jake could see the worry in her eyes. At the front of the hall sat the council speaker. His name was Veltar, and he belonged to a race called the Keth Mori. He looked like a giant praying mantis, but his shell was silver and his eyes were bright green. When he spoke, his voice came through a translation device that made it sound cold and mechanical. "The Council has made its decision about the human race," Veltar said. His words echoed through the great hall. "After much discussion, we have decided that humans are too dangerous to remain in the galactic community." Jake felt his heart sink, but he kept his face empty of emotion. He had expected this. For months, the other races had been complaining about human behavior. They said humans were too violent and too unpredictable. They said humans could not be trusted to follow proper procedures. "The human military is too aggressive," continued a delegate from the Zeridian Empire. The Zeridians looked like jellyfish, but with long tentacles that they used like arms. "They do not follow orders from the Council. They act on their own and cause problems." Another voice spoke up. This one belonged to an Avari delegate. The Avari looked like large eagles but with hands instead of talons. "Humans cannot be controlled. They make decisions based on emotion instead of logic. This makes them dangerous to galactic peace," Lisa stepped forward. "Honored delegates," she said in a clear voice, "humanity has served the galactic community well for 20 years. We have contributed to science, trade, and security. We have helped many species and asked for little in return. That is exactly the problem," said Veltar. "Humans help without being asked. You interfere in situations that do not concern you. You break treaties and ignore proper procedures when you think you know better." Jake remembered the incident they were talking about. 3 months ago, human Marines had been stationed at Kepler Trading Post as part of a joint security force. Pirates had attacked the station and taken hostages. The Council's rules said that all forces should wait for proper authorization before acting. The authorization process usually took 6 hours. The human Marines had not waited. They had gone in immediately and saved over 200 civilian lives from 12 different species. But they had also killed 37 pirates and destroyed 2 pirate ships. The Council said this was excessive force. They said the humans should have tried to negotiate first. "The incident at Kepler Station proves our point," said another delegate. This one was from the Threnar Republic. The Threnar looked like walking bears, but with longer arms and no fur. "Humans killed without trying other options first. They put their own judgment above Council authority. Those pirates were killing hostages," Jake said quietly. "Every minute we waited meant more innocent people would die." "That was not your decision to make," Veltar replied sharply. "The Council has procedures for handling such situations. Humans consistently ignore these procedures and act on their own," Lisa tried again. "Perhaps we can work out some kind of compromise. Humanity is willing to accept additional oversight or training programs." But Veltar was already shaking his large triangular head. "The decision is final. Humanity is expelled from the Galactic Council effective immediately. All human military forces must withdraw from Council space within 30 standard days. All trade agreements are canceled. All joint research projects are terminated. All human colonies outside your home system must be evacuated." The hall filled with the sounds of agreement from the alien delegates. Jake could hear clicking and chirping and humming sounds that the translators turned into words of support for the decision. Not one voice spoke up for humanity. Furthermore, Veltar continued, humanity is restricted to your home solar system. No human ships will be allowed to enter Council space without special permission. Any violations will be considered acts of war. Jake felt anger rising in his chest, but he pushed it down. Getting angry now would only prove their point about human emotion and violence. Instead, he looked around the hall at all the alien faces watching them. Some looked satisfied. Others looked uncomfortable, but none of them protested the decision. "We understand," Lisa said finally. Her voice was steady and professional. "Humanity accepts the Council's decision." This seemed to surprise many of the delegates. They had expected the humans to argue or threaten or make demands. Other species had done all of these things when faced with expulsion. The Karathi had threatened war. The Velen had offered huge bribes. The Nexari had begged and pleaded for mercy, but the humans just accepted it. Jake and Lisa turned and walked toward the exit. Their footsteps echoed in the suddenly quiet hall. No one spoke as they passed between the rows of alien delegates. Jake kept his eyes forward and his back straight. Lisa walked beside him with the same calm dignity she had shown throughout the entire proceeding. As they reached the doors, Jake heard one delegate whisper to another, "That was easier than expected." Another voice replied, "Yes, humans are strange. They give up without a fight." Jake almost smiled at that. The aliens thought they understood humans, but they were wrong about so many things. Humans did not give up without a fight, but they also knew when a fight could not be won. The Council had made up its mind months ago. Nothing Jake or Lisa could have said would have changed the outcome. Outside the hall, Jake and Lisa stood in the corridor for a moment. Through the large windows, they could see the space station that housed the Galactic Council. Ships from dozens of different worlds moved back and forth, carrying delegates and supplies and trade goods. "Well," Lisa said quietly, "I guess we better start making calls." Jake nodded. They had a lot of work to do. Every human in Council space needed to be contacted and told to come home. Military bases had to be shut down. Research stations had to be evacuated. Trade posts had to be closed. Diplomatic missions had to be recalled. It would be the largest evacuation in human history, and they had 30 days to do it all. Dr. Ben Rodriguez stood in the main laboratory of Research Station Omega-7 and watched his team pack the last of their equipment. The station had been humanity's most important research facility outside Earth. For 12 years, it had been home to scientists from 7 different species, all working together to unlock the secrets of alien biology and medicine. Now the humans were leaving and taking their research with them. "All the data cores are secured," said Dr. Amy Collins as she supervised the loading crew. Amy had been Ben's assistant for 4 years and knew the research better than anyone except Ben himself. "The alien scientists keep asking if we can leave." "Copies, but Director Chen was very clear about that." Ben nodded as he watched the Caridian scientists gathered near the observation deck. They looked confused and worried. The Caridians were tall, thin beings with pale blue skin and large black eyes. They had worked closely with the human team for years and had become something like friends. Dr. Zenthara approached Ben slowly. She was the lead Caridian researcher and had co-authored dozens of papers with Ben. Her translator made her voice sound sad when she spoke. "Ben, this makes no sense," she said. "Your work on cross-species immune systems has saved millions of lives across the galaxy. The Council cannot simply throw away 20 years of progress." "The Council has made their decision," Ben replied. He continued checking items off his evacuation list without looking up. "We have to respect that." "But the cancer research project," Zenthara insisted. "We are so close to a breakthrough. Without human pattern recognition algorithms, we will never complete it." Ben finally looked at her. Zenthara had been a good friend and an excellent scientist, but there was nothing he could do about the situation. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "Maybe you can find another way." The truth was that Ben doubted they could. Human brains work differently. than alien minds. Humans could see patterns and make connections that alien logic often missed. The cancer research had succeeded because human intuition had guided the alien mathematical models. Without that combination, the project would probably fail. But Ben did not say this. He just continued packing. Across the station, similar scenes were playing out. Human engineers were shutting down systems they had designed and built. Human doctors were transferring patients to alien medical staff who did not fully understand the treatments. Human security officers were handing over their posts to alien replacements who had never dealt with the kind of problems humans solved every day. Lieutenant Colonel Steve Parker was having the hardest conversation of his military career. He stood in the command center of Rim Defense Station Alpha and looked at the tactical displays that showed 3 entire star sectors. For 8 years, this station had been the early warning system that protected those sectors from pirates and raiders, and worse things that came from the dark spaces between stars. Steve had built this network from nothing. He had convinced dozens of alien species to work together and share information. He had created response protocols that could coordinate ships from different worlds with different technologies and different command structures. It had taken years, but he had made it work. Now he was handing it all over to General Morduke of the Threnar Republic. "Colonel, I do not understand how this system functions," Morduke said. He was looking at displays full of data streams and communication channels and tactical overlays. "There are too many variables. Too many different technologies. How do you coordinate responses across such distances?" "You learn to think fast and trust your people," Steve replied. "The key is not to overthink it. When something bad happens, you send whoever is closest, and you figure out the details later." Morduke looked uncomfortable. "But what about proper authorization procedures? What about chain of command protocols? What about equipment compatibility issues?" Steve almost laughed. Those were exactly the kind of problems that slowed down alien responses. Humans had learned to cut through bureaucracy when lives were at stake. They had developed ways to make different technologies work together even when the manufacturers said it was impossible. They had created informal networks of trust that let them act quickly when speed mattered. "The manual has all the standard procedures," Steve said as he handed over a datapad. "But honestly, most of the important stuff happens between the lines. You'll figure it out." But Steve knew they probably would not figure it out, not in time. The rim sectors were dangerous places and pirates moved fast. By the time alien commanders worked through their proper procedures and got authorization from their governments and solved their compatibility problems, the raids would be over and the victims would be dead or gone. Steve had saved thousands of lives over the years by ignoring proper procedures and acting on his own authority. But that was exactly the kind of behavior that had gotten humans kicked out of the council. At the Helix Institute, Dr. Maria Santos was explaining to her replacement why the quantum biology experiments could not simply be continued without human involvement. Her replacement was a Vorthak scientist named Kelthara. The Vorthak looked like walking crystals and thought in perfect mathematical logic. "The equations are all documented," Kelthara said. "The procedures are clearly written. I do not see why." "We cannot proceed," Maria tried to explain, but she knew it was hopeless. "The math only tells you what should happen," she said. "But biology is messy. Living things don't follow perfect equations. You need intuition to know when something is going wrong and creativity to figure out how to fix it. Intuition is not scientific," Kelthara replied. "Creativity introduces unpredictable variables. We will follow the documented procedures exactly." Maria nodded and continued packing her personal items. The quantum biology project had been her life's work. She had spent 10 years learning to communicate with alien crystal entities that existed in multiple dimensions at once. The breakthrough discoveries had only been possible because Maria had been willing to think outside normal scientific methods. Following the procedures exactly would get them nowhere. But explaining human intuition to a crystal being was like explaining color to someone who had never seen light. On the merchant station at Vega Prime, Captain Tony Chen was closing down his shipping operation. For 15 years, he had run cargo between human and alien worlds. His company had grown from one small ship to a fleet of 30 vessels, carrying everything from rare metals to medical supplies to exotic foods. The alien merchants who had worked with Tony gathered to watch him go. Many of them looked worried. Tony had been more than just a business partner to many of them. He had been someone they could trust to keep his word and deliver on time and help them solve problems that other companies would not touch. "Tony, who will carry the emergency medical supplies to the outer colonies?" asked Merchant Velnara. She was a Zeridian who had been trading with Tony for 8 years. "Your ships are the only ones fast enough and reliable enough for those routes. Someone else will figure it out," Tony said as he signed the last of his business termination documents. There are other shipping companies, but they both knew that was not really true. The outer colonies were dangerous and unprofitable routes. Most alien companies avoided them because the risks were too high and the profits too small. Tony had kept those routes running because he felt responsible for the isolated settlements that depended on regular supply runs. Without those supplies, some of the colonies would not survive. But that was not Tony's problem anymore. All across, Council Space humans were quietly closing their businesses and packing their belongings and saying goodbye to alien friends and colleagues. They did not complain or argue or demand compensation for their losses. They just did what needed to be done as efficiently as possible. The aliens watching them leave seemed surprised by how calmly the humans accepted their fate. Most species would have protested or tried to negotiate or made threats, but humans just followed orders and prepared to go home. What the aliens did not understand was that humans had learned long ago that sometimes you lose, and when you lose, you accept it with dignity and move on. Fighting a battle you cannot win just wastes time and energy that could be better used elsewhere. The humans were not giving up. They were just being practical. But as the last human ships left Council Space, many aliens began to wonder if they had made a mistake. The humans had been quiet and efficient and reliable. They had solved problems and prevented conflicts and kept things running smoothly. Now they were gone, and someone else would have to do all those jobs. The aliens were about to learn just how hard those jobs really were. 6 months had passed since the last human ship left Council Space, and Speaker Veltar was beginning to worry. He sat in his private office, reviewing reports from across the galaxy, and none of them contained good news. Trade revenues were down 20%. Pirate attacks had increased by 40% in the outer sectors. 3 major research projects had stopped completely, and 7 more were behind schedule. Veltar's assistant, Korth Allah, entered the office carrying another stack of reports. She was a young Kethmori with bright silver shell and nervous energy. "Speaker, there are more complaints from the Rim Defense Network," she said. "Response times to emergency calls have tripled, and they are requesting additional resources." "Additional resources," Veltar muttered as he looked through the files. "Everything requires additional resources now. What happened to the efficiency we had before?" But he knew what had happened. The humans were gone, and with them had gone a lot of things that nobody had paid attention to until they were missing. At the Helix Institute, Dr. Kelthera was discovering that following procedures exactly was not producing the results she had expected. The quantum biology project had made no progress in 6 months. Every experiment failed in ways that the documentation said should not be possible. The mathematical models were perfect, but the actual organisms refused to behave according to the math. "Perhaps we need to contact the human Dr. Santos," suggested her assistant. "She might be able to explain what we are doing wrong." "Absolutely not," Kelthera replied sharply. "We do not need human intuition and creativity. We have logic and proper scientific method. We will solve this problem correctly, but privately, Kelthera was beginning to understand what Dr. Santos had tried to tell her. Living things were not logical. They did unexpected things for reasons that made no mathematical sense. The human scientist had somehow known how to work with this chaos, instead of against it. Without that knowledge, the project was going nowhere. On Vega Prime, the merchant station was struggling with supply shortages that had never been a problem before. Captain Chen's shipping company had handled dozens of difficult routes that other companies avoided. Now those routes were not being serviced at all, and the colonies that depended on them were running out of essential supplies. Station manager Vorthek called an emergency meeting with all the remaining shipping companies. "We need someone to take over the outer colony routes," he announced to the group of alien captains. "The medical supplies are critical, and several settlements are reporting shortages." Captain Holmar of the Zeridian fleet spoke first. "Those routes are too dangerous and unprofitable. Our insurance companies will not cover ships that travel to those sectors." "The human company managed it somehow," pointed out Captain Velkris of the Avari Transport Guild. "They made those runs regularly for 15 years. The humans were reckless," Holmar replied. "They took risks that no sensible captain would take. That is why they were removed from the council, but the colonies still needed supplies and no one seemed willing to deliver them." Vorthek began to realize that the human shipping company had not been reckless at all. They had been brave and efficient and willing to help people who needed help even when it was not profitable. Now those people were going to suffer, because no one else was willing to do what the humans had done. At Rim Defense Station, Alpha General Morduk was learning that coordinating multi-species defense operations was much harder than he had imagined. When pirate raids occurred, it took him hours to get authorization from different governments and days to coordinate response fleets. By the time his forces arrived, the pirates were long gone, and the damage was done. His communications officer, Lieutenant Velthera, brought him another emergency report. "General, we have received distress calls from 3 different systems in the past 6 hours. The Kepler mining colony is under attack. The Arctos trade station has lost contact with 2 of its cargo ships. The Vegan agricultural world reports unknown ships in their outer system." Morduk looked at the tactical display and felt overwhelmed. 3 different crises in 3 different sectors, all requiring immediate response. He needed to contact the Caridian Navy about Kepler. He needed to ask the Threnar Defense Force about Arctos. He needed to coordinate with the Avari Patrol Fleet about Vega. Each of those requests would require formal paperwork and approval from multiple commanders and clearance from government officials. The process would take at least 12 hours, even if everything went perfectly. "What would Colonel Parker have done?" Velthara asked quietly. Morduk knew the answer to that question. Steve Parker would have sent the nearest ships to all 3 locations immediately. He would have worried about paperwork and authorization later. He would have coordinated the response himself using his network of contacts and his reputation for getting things done. But Parker was gone, and with him had gone the informal systems that made rapid response possible. "Send the formal requests," Morduk ordered. "Follow proper procedures." He knew it was probably too late to help anyone, but he did not know what else to do. On the research station where Dr. Rodriguez had worked, the alien scientists were struggling with a medical crisis that should have been easily solved. A new virus had appeared on 3 different worlds and was making thousands of people sick. The symptoms were similar to diseases they had seen before, but the treatments were not working. Dr. Zenthara and her team had all the data and all the equipment they needed. They had computer models and genetic analysis and tissue samples. But they could not figure out why their treatments were failing. "The human doctor would have found the answer by now," said Dr. Kelthan during their daily briefing. "He had a way of seeing connections that we miss." "Dr. Rodriguez was not more intelligent than we are," Zenthara replied. "He simply approached problems differently. But that different approach was exactly what they needed." Human pattern recognition. Could find similarities between seemingly unrelated things. Human intuition could make leaps that pure logic could not follow. Human creativity could suggest solutions that mathematical analysis would never consider. Without those abilities, the research team was stuck using methods that were not working while people continued to get sick. Across the galaxy, similar problems were multiplying. The diplomatic corps was struggling to prevent conflicts between species that had been getting along fine for years. Without Ambassador Carter's informal mediation network, small disputes were growing into major problems. The cultural exchange program had collapsed completely when 3 different species took offense at each other's art forms, and no one knew how to explain that the insults were not intentional. The Galactic Trade Commission was falling behind in processing new agreements because their human liaison had handled most of the complex negotiations that required understanding multiple legal systems. The Emergency Response Coordination Center was failing to respond to natural disasters because their human staff had been the ones who knew how to cut through bureaucracy and get help where it was needed quickly. Speaker Veltar reviewed all of these reports and began to understand that the Council had made a serious mistake. The humans had not been causing problems. They had been preventing problems. They had been the glue that held many different systems together. Perhaps we should consider reopening communications with Earth, suggested Councillor Yith-Ara during their weekly meeting. Her crystalline form pulsed with nervous energy. The economic impact alone justifies reconsideration. Absolutely not, Veltar replied, but his voice lacked conviction. We made our decision based on sound reasoning. The humans were unpredictable and violent. Their unpredictability was adaptability, Yith-Ara pointed out. Their violence was directed at protecting others. Maybe we misunderstood what we were seeing. Veltar did not want to admit that possibility, but the evidence was becoming hard to ignore. The galaxy had been more peaceful and more prosperous with humans in it. Systems that had worked smoothly for years were now breaking down. Problems that had been solved automatically were now becoming crises. The humans had not been the source of problems. They had been the solution to problems that no one else even noticed existed. But admitting that mistake would mean admitting that the entire Council had been wrong. It would mean accepting that human methods were sometimes better than alien methods. It would mean swallowing their pride and asking for help. Veltar was not ready to do that yet. But as the reports continued to pile up and the problems continued to multiply, he was beginning to wonder how long he could afford to wait. The galaxy was learning to function without humans, but it was not learning to function well. Things that had been easy were now difficult. Tasks that had been routine were now complicated. Crises that had been manageable were now becoming disasters. The humans had walked away quietly when they were asked to leave, but their absence was anything but quiet. It was loud and obvious and getting harder to ignore every day. 2 years had passed since humanity's expulsion, when the crisis in the Vegan sector reached the breaking point. The Korth Empire had been testing Council defenses for months with small raids and probing attacks. When they realized how slow and uncoordinated the response had become, they launched a full invasion. Admiral Zektar stood in the Council war room looking at displays that showed red warning lights across 6 star systems. His fleet commanders from 12 different species sat around the table arguing about response strategies while entire worlds fell to the enemy. "We need to coordinate a counterattack immediately," said General Morduk. "The Korth have taken 4 systems in 3 weeks. If we do not stop them now, they will control the entire sector. My government requires formal authorization before committing our fleet," replied Admiral Hulnara of the Zeridian Navy. "We cannot simply rush into battle without proper planning. Planning takes time we do not have," Morduk shot back. "The longer we wait, the stronger the Korth position becomes." Admiral Zektar listened to the familiar argument that had been going on for days. Every species had different requirements for military action. The Caridians needed approval from their High Council, which met once per week. The Avari required environmental impact studies before moving their ships through certain space lanes. The Vorthok demanded detailed mathematical projections of success probabilities. By the time all the requirements were met, the war would be over. "What would Admiral Morrison have done?" asked Captain Velcris quietly. She was young for her rank and had served under human command during joint exercises years ago. The room fell silent. Everyone knew the answer, but no one wanted to say it. Jake Morrison would have had ships moving within hours. He would have coordinated the response himself and dealt with paperwork later. He would have found ways to make different fleets work together even when their government said it was impossible. Admiral Morrison was removed from command for good reasons, Veltar said stiffly. "We cannot base our strategies on human recklessness," but privately everyone in the room knew that human recklessness was looking better than alien caution. While they debated procedures and followed proper protocols, billions of civilians were falling under Korth occupation. On the medical research station, Dr. Zenthara faced her own crisis. The virus that had appeared months ago had mutated into something much worse. It was now spreading between species and killing people faster than before. Her team had tried everything they could think of, but nothing was working. "We need to contact Dr. Rodriguez," said her assistant, Dr. Kelton. "He has more experience with cross-species viral research than anyone in the galaxy." "The Council has forbidden contact with human researchers," Zenthara replied. "We must solve this ourselves," but she knew they were not going to solve it. They had been working on the problem for 8 months with no progress. The virus was behaving in ways that made no sense according to their models. It seemed to adapt and change faster than their treatments could keep up with. Dr. Rodriguez had dealt with similar problems before. He had a way of thinking about viruses as living enemies instead of mathematical equations. He understood that. They were trying to survive and would find ways around any treatment that threatened them. Without that understanding, the research team was always one step behind. They would develop a treatment and the virus would evolve to resist it. They would create a vaccine and the virus would change its structure. They were fighting a war against an enemy they did not understand. Meanwhile, people continued to die on dozens of worlds, while the medical community struggled with a problem that might have been solved months ago if they had been willing to ask for human help. In the rim sectors, the security situation had become a complete disaster. Without Colonel Parker's rapid response network, pirate raids had increased by 300%. Entire trade routes had become too dangerous to use. Mining colonies were being abandoned because they could not get protection. Captain Rex Logan of the merchant vessel Star Runner sent out a distress call when his ship came under attack near the Altair system. "This is Star Runner, requesting immediate assistance," he broadcast on emergency frequencies. "We are under attack by 4 pirate vessels and cannot escape." The call was received by 3 different naval stations, but none of them could respond quickly enough. The Caridian patrol ship was 2 days away. The Threnar Defense Fleet needed approval from their homeworld before crossing into that sector. The Avari Rapid Response Unit was busy with paperwork from their last deployment. By the time help arrived, the Star Runner was gone. The pirates had taken the cargo and the crew and disappeared into the dark spaces between systems where no one could track them. Similar incidents were happening almost daily. The pirates had learned that Council forces were slow and uncoordinated. They had adapted their tactics to take advantage of the bureaucracy and red tape that slowed down military responses. The humans had been different. They had ships stationed throughout the rim sectors that could respond within hours. They had informal agreements with local militias and merchant captains that let them coordinate responses without going through official channels. They had been willing to take risks and make decisions without waiting for permission. Now those ships were gone, and the pirates knew it. They were getting bolder and more aggressive because they knew no one could stop them quickly enough to matter. Speaker. Veltar received reports of these failures every day, and each one made him more uncomfortable. The council chambers that had once been filled with proud declarations about galactic unity were now filled with complaints and demands for action. "The situation is becoming impossible," declared Councillor Yathara during an emergency session. "Our military cannot coordinate effective responses. Our scientists cannot solve critical problems. Our economy is suffering from trade disruptions and security failures." "We knew there would be an adjustment period," Veltar replied, but his voice sounded weak even to himself. "These problems will resolve themselves once we develop new procedures." "It has been 2 years," interrupted Councillor Morthek of the Threnar Republic. "How long must we wait for these new procedures to work? How many more people must die while we learn to do jobs that humans were already doing well?" The uncomfortable truth was that no one knew how to replace what the humans had provided. Their military coordination had relied on personal relationships and trust that could not be replicated by committees. Their scientific breakthroughs had depended on intuition and creativity that could not be programmed into computers. Their economic success had been built on willingness to take risks and help others even when it was not profitable. The alien species were logical and methodical and thorough, but they were not adaptable in the way humans had been. They could not think outside established procedures or make connections between unrelated things or act quickly in crisis situations. "Perhaps it is time to reconsider our position," suggested Admiral Zektar carefully. "The humans were expelled for being unpredictable and violent, but maybe those traits were actually valuable." "You suggest we admit we made a mistake?" Veltar asked sharply. "I suggest we admit that we misunderstood what we were seeing," Zektar replied. "Human unpredictability was adaptability. Human violence was protection of innocence. Human disregard for procedures was efficiency in crisis situations." The council chamber fell silent as the delegates considered this possibility. Admitting error was difficult for any government, but admitting that another species was better at certain tasks was almost impossible for beings who prided themselves on logical superiority. "What would you have us do?" Veltar asked finally. "Invite them back and apologize for our error. I would have us survive," Zektar answered bluntly. "The Korth Empire is winning this war because we cannot coordinate our defenses. The plague is spreading because we cannot solve medical problems. The economy is failing because we cannot protect trade routes. We are failing at basic governmental responsibilities." As if to emphasize his point, an aide rushed into the chamber with another emergency report. "Speakers, the Korth have just taken the vegan agricultural world," she announced. 3 billion civilians are now under enemy occupation. The chamber erupted in shocked voices and angry demands for action. But everyone knew that action would take days or weeks to organize while the Korth consolidated their gains and prepared for the next assault. Veltar looked around at the chaos and realized that his pride was going to cost the galaxy everything they had built together. The humans had walked away quietly when asked to leave, but their absence was destroying the civilization that had rejected them. The time had come to swallow that pride and ask for help. The only question was whether it was already too late. The emergency council session was called after the Battle of Tertius Prime, where 6 different alien fleets had failed to work together despite having twice as many ships as the enemy. The Korth Empire had won because their forces acted as one unit, while the council forces spent hours arguing about tactics and coordination. Now, 12 billion beings lived under enemy occupation, and the refugee crisis was growing worse every day. Speaker Veltar looked around the council chamber at faces, filled with fear and anger and desperation. The proud alliance of species that had ruled the galaxy for centuries was falling apart. Their military was ineffective, their economy was collapsing, their scientific progress had stopped. Diseases were spreading unchecked through systems that had once been models of galactic cooperation. "We cannot continue like this," declared Admiral Zektar. The Korth will control half the galaxy within a year if we do not change our approach. Our current methods are not working. What do you suggest? Asked Veltar, though he suspected he already knew the answer. We contact Earth, Zektar said simply. We admit our mistake and ask for help. The chamber erupted in angry voices. Some delegates shouted that it would be a sign of weakness. Others argued that humans could not be trusted. A few insisted that alien science and military power were superior to anything humans could offer. But Counselor Ythara stood up and her crystalline form pulsed with bright light that commanded attention. My people are dying, she said in a voice that cut through the arguments. The plague has reached 17 worlds in my sector. Our medical teams cannot stop it. Our researchers cannot understand it. Our pride is worth nothing if our people are dead. One by one, other delegates began to speak. The Zeridian representative talked about trade routes that were no longer safe. The Avari delegate mentioned colonies that had been abandoned because they could not get supplies. The Threnar general described military defeats that could have been prevented with better coordination. The humans were not our enemies, said Counselor Morthek quietly. They were our solution to problems we did not even know we had. We threw away 20 years of progress because we were afraid of beings who thought differently than we do. Veltar felt his resistance crumbling as he listened to the voices around him. Every speaker told the same story. Things had worked better when humans were part of the galactic community. Systems had run more smoothly. Problems had been solved more quickly. Crises had been managed more effectively. Very well, he said finally. We will attempt to contact Earth. The transmission was sent on all emergency frequencies. It was a formal request for diplomatic contact marked with the highest priority codes. The message was simple and direct. The Galactic Council requested an immediate response from Earth's government regarding matters of mutual concern. The reply came not from Earth, but from a small communication station orbiting the moon. The operator was a human named Carl Peters who spoke with casual professionalism that somehow made the situation feel even more embarrassing. This is Luna Station, Carl said. We'll pass your message along to the appropriate people. Please stand. By for a response, no anger, no accusations, no demands for apologies. Just quiet efficiency that reminded everyone listening of why humans had been so valuable in the first place. The official response came 6 hours later from Ambassador Lisa Carter, speaking from the United Nations building in Geneva. Her image appeared on the main display screen, and she looked exactly the same as she had 2 years earlier when she had walked out of the council chambers. The council has requested diplomatic contact, she said without emotion. Earth is willing to discuss the current situation. We can meet at a neutral location if you prefer. Veltar felt relief flood through him. The humans were willing to talk. They had not refused outright or made impossible demands. There was still hope. We would be honored to meet here at Council Station, he replied. When would be convenient? We can have a delegation there in 3 days, Lisa answered. Is that acceptable? 3 days later, Jake Morrison walked into the council chambers, followed by a small group of human advisors. He looked older and more tired than before, but his eyes still held the same steady confidence that had once coordinated impossible military operations across half the galaxy. The council delegates watched in silence as the humans took their seats. No one seemed to know how to begin the conversation. How do you apologize for destroying your own civilization out of fear and pride? Jake solved the problem by speaking first. We understand you're having some difficulties with the Korth Empire, he said, as if the previous 2 years had never happened. We've been monitoring the situation, and we have some thoughts about possible solutions. He activated a holographic display that showed the current military situation in perfect detail. Every ship position, every supply line, every strategic weakness, the humans had been watching and analyzing even though they were no longer part of the council. The Korth are using standard conquest tactics, Jake continued. They hit systems with overwhelming force and then consolidate their gains while you argue about responses. Your fleets are being defeated in detail because you cannot coordinate effectively. Within an hour, Jake had outlined a complete strategy for turning the war around. It required cooperation between species that had been feuding for months. It demanded rapid deployment of forces without waiting for full authorization. It meant taking risks and making decisions based on incomplete information. In other words, it required thinking and acting like humans. This plan could work, admitted Admiral Zektar after studying the proposal. But it requires a level of trust and coordination that we have been unable to achieve. That's why we're here, Jake replied. Humans are good at making different groups work together. We're good at cutting through bureaucracy when time matters. We're good at taking calculated risks to achieve important goals. Dr. Ben Rodriguez had returned as well and was already working with alien medical teams on the plague problem. Within days, he had identified the key factor that their models had been missing. The virus was not just adapting to treatments, it was communicating with other virus colonies and sharing information about successful adaptations. You were treating it like a mathematical equation, he explained to Dr. Zenthara. But it's actually behaving like a distributed intelligence. Each infection site learns from all the others. You need to disrupt that communication before you can develop effective treatments. It was exactly the kind of insight that alien logic would never have produced. The mathematical models could not account for viral behavior that seemed to involve decision-making and cooperation, but human intuition had recognized the pattern and found a way to exploit it. Engineer Maria Santos was back at work fixing infrastructure. Problems that had been slowly getting worse since the humans left. Systems that had been designed to work together were failing because no one understood the informal modifications that kept them running. Equipment that should have lasted decades was breaking down because maintenance schedules had not accounted for actual usage patterns. The manuals only tell you how things are supposed to work, Maria explained to her alien counterparts. But reality is always messier than the manuals. You need people who can adapt and improvise and find creative solutions to unexpected problems all. Across council space, humans quietly returned to jobs they had never asked for but had filled out of necessity. They did not demand apologies or recognition. They did not insist on special treatment or guarantees against future expulsion. They simply saw what needed to be done and started doing it. The war against the Korth Empire turned around within weeks. Human coordination allowed alien fleets to work together effectively for the first time in years. The plague was brought under control as human medical insights guided alien research teams to successful treatments. Trade routes reopened as human shipping companies resumed operations that other carriers had abandoned. Speaker Veltar watched all of this happen and began to understand something profound about the human species. They were not conquerors or saviors or heroes in any traditional sense. They were gardeners who saw broken things and felt compelled to fix them. They were problem solvers who could not walk away from suffering when they had the ability to help. The Council had feared human violence, but violence was just a tool. What they should have recognized was the purpose behind that tool. Humans used force to protect others. They broke rules to save lives. They ignored procedures to prevent disasters. And when they were asked to leave, they had done so quietly and without bitterness, because they understood that sometimes you lose arguments, even when you are right. But they had also continued to watch and prepare because they knew that eventually the problems would become too big to ignore, and someone would need to help fix them. The humans had walked away quietly when they were told they were not wanted. They had returned just as quietly when they were needed, and the galaxy slowly began to understand that the most important contributions are often the ones that happen so naturally and consistently that they become invisible until they disappear.